This is a comprehensive list of horror JRPGs released in North America, all in the vein of classic Sweet Home on the NES, for example, except that game never left Japan. I'll also be including some honorable mentions at the end that aren't horror JRPGs, more like dark fantasy games with perhaps some horror elements. So with that said, let's begin. Let's start with Baroque. Baroque is an action RPG which came out on the Sega Saturn and PlayStation during the late 90s. Around a decade later, it was remade for the PS2 and the Wii, later ported to iOS. We didn't get the original versions, not even its remaster on Switch 5 years ago, but the originals have been fan-translated for a while. It takes place in a post-apocalyptic setting where what's left of humanity has been turned into twisted monsters and horrible creatures, most of them trying to kill you. This is because your amnesiac protagonist is trying to purify them by the guidance of this mysterious archangel. The setting, graphics, and monster design are very unsettling to say the least. The overall atmosphere and music gives me Shin Megami Tensei vibes, but much darker. The gameplay is like a roguelike, as in you explore randomly generated dungeons advancing through floors until you reach the exit or defeat a boss. Both versions are insanely hard and play the same way, but they have one major difference between them. The original versions are played in first person, which might give you a scarier feel because of the perspective. The remake is in third person but with full movement control camera and character. Mixed reviews were prominent with all versions, especially the remake, which developed a bad reputation. Neither is a great game, but they're worth playing just to experience the horrific nature they have to offer. I did a full review of the remake not long ago, I'll leave it at the end if you want to watch it. Next is Soul Sacrifice. Action RPG, which is still exclusive to the PS Vita. Keiji Inafume was the main designer, mainly known for the Mega Man series. The game's horror elements preside within its plot aside from the blood and gore, the enemy design, the boss design, and the other characters' stories, those often involving psychological horror situations. A god-like sorcerer absorbs human sacrifices to stay immortal. Your character was supposed to be one of those sacrifices, but a horrific-looking book saves you and now you're off to train and fight the sorcerer. How will you train? By entering the book's written stories about the sorcerer and previous characters that fought him. The gameplay reminds me of God Eater, as in you go into missions with very few enemies and a super hard boss usually nearby, but the main mechanic is to sacrifice a part of your body to create special skills in order to defeat these bosses. You can also sacrifice your allies to achieve similar purposes. It's a very twisted game to say the least, but it's hardcore fun at its best. Moving on to Undernauts, Labyrinth of Yomi. This is a dungeon crawler which perfectly combines survival horror with RPG. It's in the vein of Elminage, a highly obscure series that are dark fantasy games, but also dungeon crawlers in first person like this one, except Undernauts is more about the horror than anything else. You belong to a team of explorers who are sent to kill the Undernauts, creatures that have infested the only place where humanity can find resources to keep on living. Except when you go down there, you find extremely scary labyrinths with very twisted and horrific monster designs. The rest of the gameplay is as classic as it gets, with you exploring the dungeons with a party of up to 6 playable characters and fighting in turn-based battles. It's a really challenging game like most of its kind, or like the developer's previous game, Stranger of Sword City, which is also a bit dark but not really horror. You can find this gem on most modern systems nowadays. Here is Folklore. This PS3 exclusive is an action RPG with a dual protagonist feature, though you have to beat the game with both characters to unlock their final chapters, final boss, and ending. What makes it a horror RPG isn't exactly its Halloween-esque town, NPC, and monster design. That's more of a Tim Burton style, which might resonate with its fans out there. The genre blends in more within its intriguing crime scenes and paranormal themes. You see, Ellen is looking for clues to her mother's death as she mysteriously receives a letter from her one day. So she embarks to this Dublin village in Ireland to look for her or make sense of the letter. Keats is a reporter who specializes in the occult, who goes to the same village to find a woman who claims to be attacked by monsters. Without spoiling anything, let's just say you will encounter some horrific stuff that happened to some of the villagers as you advance through the story. The rest is a unique action RPG where you use the PS3 6-axis feature to capture the enemy's soul to use it as an attack. Up to 4 types can be equipped to execute your regular attacks. Usually only 1 or 2 are adequate to fight the bosses in this game, which will task you to trying to find their weakness. There's more to it, but you get the idea. It's a really good action RPG that blends in well with the horror genre, but with less intensity. Moving on to Shadow Tower. This is a first-person action RPG developed by From Software as a follow-up to their King's Field series. Those are dark fantasy RPGs, but it's Shadow Tower that crosses the blurry line between dark fantasy and horror. However, it's slow-paced with poor controls, camera, and combat. There's barely or no music whatsoever to accompany your exploration in the tower as you find equipment and items, defeating monsters and gaining experience to level up. So the lack of music might be horrific now that I think about it. The monster design isn't quite as horrific, but you might get some unexpected jump scares in certain rooms. Still though, the real horror of this game is that it's extremely bad. It's a terrible game and perhaps the worst JRPG on the original PlayStation. It did have its fans back when it was released, at least in Japan, because they made a sequel called Shadow Tower Abyss on the PS2. It was never released overseas. I haven't played that, and I probably never will, cause honestly I hated this rare and expensive game on PS1. Next is Bloodborne. Speaking about From Software, the Souls games are dark fantasy RPGs also, not what I could call a horror JRPG. Bloodborne, on the other hand, is the only one fitting for this list. In the Souls games you have to be careful on how to fight the enemies, right? In Bloodborne you do the same, but in a horror setting. The environments and the atmosphere of the game is very scary and bloody. Not only that, exploring around needs to be done just as carefully as you fight. You never know what you're gonna see or what you're gonna find while moving around the game's many dark and gritty areas. The monsters are just as scary or straight up horrible that they make you wanna tread with extra care. So, in other words, this game's basically horror Dark Souls. Here's Death End Request 2. I've talked about these games several times during the last couple of years. I did a review of it which got a lot of views in 2023. It's a direct sequel to a game that isn't horror, just with some gruesome deaths and mature themes. This one, however, went bonkers with the genre when Idea Factory brought over the creator of the Corpse Party games. Those are adventure or visual novel games, not RPGs in case you were wondering. Anyway, so this one has you controlling Mai, a mentally disturbed girl who killed her abusive father and now lives in an orphanage. Horrible things seem to happen at midnight, so she goes to investigate, only to encounter these nightmarish layouts with dreadful creatures roaming around. The game has this very eerie vibe to it as you explore around and fight monsters. It really does make you feel like you're playing a survival horror game, especially when you're trying to escape some of the unkillable monsters. Like its predecessor, it has several bad endings with gruesome deaths, so prepare to see some of these depending on your choices. Combat carries over as well, with your characters executing one or various actions in a row, which might send the enemies rapidly across the screen for more damage. It's a really good game, quite horrific, dare I say. Watch my review of it if you want to know more in detail. And then there's Death End Request Code Z. This third game in the series is a spin-off and now a roguelike RPG. You enter randomly generated dungeons to fight enemies, level up, and acquire a variety of items including equipment. The story does follow the previous two games, but in some kind of weird alternate universe or timeline. It doesn't make any sense, let me tell you that. And it's got a lot of slice of life dialogue and very silly scenes that easily drive you away from the horror narrative, unlike the second game, which doesn't take long to come back to it. But it does have its insane moments, most of them bizarre, that remind you every now and then that you're playing a horror JRPG, especially with its many dead ends or bad endings, with gruesome scenes like this one. I can't show you more cause it'll offend YouTube, which is exactly the reason why Nintendo of America got also so offended and didn't localize the Switch version. Anyway, this isn't a good game. It isn't bad, just somewhat disappointing, especially in story and characters. Next is Tokyo Twilight Ghost Hunters. In this game, you literally play as a secret organization of ghost hunters. Most of them go to school, including your protagonist, but their real occupation is that of investigating the several paranormal events happening in Tokyo. Gameplay is divided in two segments, visual novel and strategy battles. During the visual novel parts, you'll get a lot of story and dialogue, but also several decisions that are based on reactions. Instead of making dialogue choices, you choose between a variety of weird symbols that are actually your reactions to what the other characters are saying. The strategy battles are played out in this board, where you move your characters based on the white or black noise the ghosts do, so you find them. When you do, a first-person view battle will occur between you and the ghost. This may or may not end in you winning, so you could end up fighting the ghost several times. I know, this looks very weird, and trust me, it takes a long time to get used to it. The game's not gonna be for everybody. I recommend watching a live stream I did of it to fully understand it, as a simple review won't be enough. It's also on PS3 and PS Vita, by the way. This is Pandora's Tower. It isn't exactly a horror game, more like you fight to avoid something beyond horrendous to happen. In fact, it's so sickening to watch that I just had to include it in the list. The whole point of it is for your character to explore the connecting towers to fight monsters and bosses. Also, you can feed his girlfriend with their flesh or hearts to decrease her transformation into a monster or stop it altogether. The horror themes here stand out when you start seeing her in this degrading way, having to watch the animations when she actually eats the monster's hearts. Ugh. Obviously, defeating a boss gives her way more chances to recover, as their hearts are the most, nutritious. Just keep in mind, there's a lot of motion control shenanigans here. While you do have regular button controls to attack and defend, you also have a chain that you use to rip the monster's heart out, but it really comes into play during the boss fights, impossible to defeat without the motion controls. To date, this is still an exclusive to the Wii. Coming right up, Koudelka. This is one of the most well-known horror JRPGs ever made, but it's an experiment gone wrong. Creator Hiroki Kikuta tried to create a survival horror game mixing turn-based combat, which was a great idea. However, the execution ended up being a mess. Tank controls, random encounters, slow animations, slow loading screens, and grid-based movement during battle. All the elements you honestly don't want to see in a mix of RPG with horror. Still, the game turned out to be quite unique and interesting thanks to these elements. I've always maintained that this isn't a bad game, just not great, but still a must play just to see how the combination of genres turned out to be, or maybe just to reflect on what not to do when mixing those two genres. Anyway, I won't explain this game to you, as by now you've probably heard about it 1,000 times. So next is Shadow Hearts. I feel that only the first game in the trilogy belongs in this list, and barely. It's a spiritual successor to Koudelka, but unlike that game, it's more of a dark fantasy setting than anything else, though it does incorporate several horror elements like the environments you traverse, the demon transformations during battle, the enemy design, and the type you face, and some of the characters' backgrounds. Some things can be pretty graphic and horrific at times. Yuri's struggle trying to come up to terms with who he really is can also be interpreted as part of the genre. Yuri meets and rescues the exorcist Alice all because a voice in his head told him to, and then you travel through several places in the real world during World War II. So you've got psychological horror, cosmic horror, supernatural themes, demons, etc., but often crossing the line between mere dark fantasy and, well, horror. Which is why this game gets a pass. The sequels were far less dark, with way more comedy and goofy characters, to the point they don't feel like horror JRPGs in the least. Here we have Shin Megami Tensei Devil Summoner Raido Kusunoha, the duology. Let's call it the duology, yeah. So we can't leave the Megami Tensei series out of the list, but we can't include all of them either. Honestly, most of them just feel like regular RPGs, just with mature themes and dark fantasy settings, mainly because of the demons. So if I had to pick the most horror themes SMT games for this list, the only ones that in my opinion classify as such, they will be the Raido Kusunoha duology, simply because the plot they have is basically a horror plot. You play as a private detective investigating paranormal activities in town that involve demons and ghosts, while most of the others are apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic settings where you choose to align with one side for the sake of stopping the other. Not exactly what I'd call horror stories, and well, it's not like this duology is scary or anything, it's just more fitting to the genre, that's all. I did feel that some of the investigations and NPC background stories were quite eerie and dreadful though. The games have a way to make you feel like you're watching a ghost story sometimes. So anyway, great duology here. I'm assuming some of you will point out Strange Journey on the DS, which is also a good choice for a horror Shin Megami Tensei RPG within the franchise. Next is Parasite Eve. Obviously, this is the most famous JRPG on the list. It's the poster child of horror JRPGs. It needs no explanation whatsoever. We all know it was very innovative, which turned out to be an excellent game. It's a bit dated in terms of exploration and controls, but it's still very, very worth playing nowadays. The one I want to mention briefly though is the sequel, also on PS1, which wasn't an RPG anymore, at least not in my opinion. Sure, you still have a leveling system and learn new abilities, but that's it. Tank controls, 100% action combat with questionable aiming. It just feels more like a Resident Evil clone than its own original thing, like the first game was. Not a bad game, just not a great game either, and not really what I will call a JRPG. Forget about the third game on the PSP. Barely anything horror and RPG whatsoever. It's actually a pretty decent game, but it's an action third-person shooter and nothing more. Moving on to Code Vein. In this game, you play as a customizable character who is nothing short of a vampire, and therefore you join a group of vampires who fight the Lost, a bunch of humans turned into hideous monsters. Taking inspiration from the From Software games, Code Vein explores these horror territories with complete freedom, as in introducing new ideas like making vampires not suck blood from humans, but rather finding blood beads from springs to consume them and become stronger. So it still has the tenacity to try and become its own universe without totally embracing the idea, hence why the ludicrous amounts of fan service. Still, I believe in a game like this, or Bloodborne, the difficulty becomes a part of that horror. The intensity of the battle or the jump scares or the spooky enemy design, all of that transmits to your hands holding the controller and responding accordingly. That's the beauty of this game, which turns that very same horror feature into a gameplay mechanic. And then, Monarch. Lastly, this isn't a horror JRPG, but it has one gameplay mechanic prior to every main mission in which you explore the school while possessed students are trying to kill you. There's a madness percentage meter and it goes up the closer they get to you. If it reaches 100%, you go mad and it's game over. The same madness meter applies to battle since it increases as you get attacked, and there are even skills that increase it if you use them. But there's no horror in that. The horror is in the exploration parts I mentioned, which also have you getting clues and solving mysteries to get the code you need to teleport into battle. I also have a review of this game if you want to check it out. As honorable mentions, I'd like to show a few JRPGs that aren't horror at all. They just have strong dark fantasy elements, such as the case of Redemption Reapers, a strategy RPG, Vagrant Story on the PS1, The Lost Child with some paranormal stuff, The Dark Spire on the DS, Wizardry on the PS2, and the first Mary Skelter Nightmares. Also, here's a picture of more JRPGs with dark fantasy, gothic, or some very small horror elements, but none that I will exactly call a horror JRPG. Well, except for Digimon Survive, but... Alright, that's the list. Thanks for watching, don't forget to subscribe and share this video with your friends. See you next time!